Is this
I'm
some
showing
kind
a
of
critical
joke?
failure
The
here.
voice cut sharp across the scorching afternoon air,
She'll hold.
dry as the desert wind that swept over the proving grounds,
Analyze
and
the
it
anomalous
carried
signal.
just enough irritation to
Confirmed.
make a dozen
Filtering
heads
now.
turn without anyone
Patch through to
saying a
command.
word. The
Immediate
M1
priority.
Abrams sat in the center of the
primary
test
conduit.
lane like a
It
sleeping
bypasses the
giant that
failsafe.
refused
I
to
see it.
wake.
Cross-reference
70
with the
tons of
schematics.
steel
No, trust
and
me.
composite
You need to
armor
pull it
baking
and
under a
reroute.
relentless
I think the wear
102
on this
degrees
gear
sun,
suggests a
its
misalignment.
surface
Yes,
shimmering
that
in
could be the
waves of
problem.
heat,
Check
its
the torque
engine
specs and the
silent in a
schematics.
way
Got
that
it.
felt almost deliberate. Around it, a cluster of engineers in clean uniforms and mirrored sunglasses hovered with tablets and diagnostic rigs, their screens glowing green with perfect system reports that contradicted the stubborn reality in front of them. Ethan Brooks stood at the front, arms crossed, jaw tight, his boot tapping once against the track before he gave the tank a firm, frustrated kick, the dull metallic thud echoing across the concrete. "We've run every check twice," he said, louder now, making sure the officers watching from the shaded bleachers could hear him. "Fuel systems, electrical, fire control. Everything says it should be operational." A faint murmur moved through the small crowd of observers, contractors, and uniformed personnel, all waiting for a demonstration that was now running nearly an hour behind schedule. Somewhere beyond the perimeter, a flag snapped in the dry wind, the sound sharp and impatient. A few yards away, standing just outside the circle of activity, was an old man no one had bothered to acknowledge. He wore a faded olive jacket despite the heat, sleeves rolled to his forearms, the fabric softened by decades of wear, and a pair of worn boots that had seen more miles than anyone there could guess. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, but his eyes, pale, steady, and unblinking, were fixed on the tank, not the people around it. He wasn't watching the engineers. He was studying the machine. Ethan noticed him only when one of the junior technicians glanced over, hesitating for a second too long. "You got something to add?" Ethan called out, his tone edged with sarcasm as he followed the technician's gaze and finally saw the old man. A few of the others chuckled quietly, the tension breaking just enough for arrogance to slip back in. The old man didn't answer. He didn't move. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of hot metal and dust, and for a moment, the entire scene felt suspended, like the tank itself had pulled everything into its silence. Ethan smirked, shaking his head. "Didn't think so," he muttered, turning back to his tablet. "We don't need guesswork. We've got data." The tablet screen reflected in his lenses, lines of flawless diagnostics scrolling past, each one insisting there was no problem to find. Behind him, the Abrams remained still, its presence heavy, its silence absolute. And the old man kept watching, as if he could hear something no one else could. The hum of idle generators filled the growing silence as the engineers circled the tank again, their movements sharper now, less confident, as if repeating the same steps might somehow force a different result. Ethan crouched near the open access panel, wiping a bead of sweat from his temple with the back of his glove before tapping rapidly across his tablet, pulling up another set of diagnostics that looked just as perfect as the last. "Fuel pressure is stable, voltage is within tolerance, no faults in the control system," he said, more to himself than anyone else, but loud enough for the nearby officers to hear the certainty in his voice. A lieutenant standing by the observation barrier shifted his weight, glancing toward the bleachers where a handful of senior personnel waited under shade, their patience thinning with every passing minute. The wind picked up again, dragging dust across the concrete in thin, restless lines, brushing against the tank's hull with a faint scraping whisper. One of the junior technicians hesitated near the rear of the vehicle, staring at a section of the armor as if trying to will it to reveal something hidden. But when Ethan looked up, the technician quickly turned away, pretending to check a cable that had already been tested twice. "We are not chasing ghosts," Ethan said, straightening up and stepping back, his tone firm, defensive now. "If there was a fault, the system would tell us." The old man finally moved. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable at first, just a single step forward into the edge of the heat haze, his boots crunching softly against the grit on the ground. He did not look at Ethan. He did not look at the officers. His eyes remained on the tank, tracing along the lines of the turret, the seams of the armor, the small imperfections that no diagnostic system ever cared about. "Machines do not always tell the truth," he said quietly, his voice low but steady. carrying farther than it should have in the open air. The words landed in the space between conversations, cutting through the background noise without raising in volume. Ethan let out a short laugh, sharp and dismissive, turning fully toward him now. "Right?" he said, gesturing loosely with his tablet. "And I guess you can hear what it is thinking." A few of the engineers smirked, the tension easing just enough for confidence to return to their faces. "We are not in some motor pool from 40 years ago," Ethan continued, stepping closer, his boots striking the concrete with deliberate emphasis. "This is a modern platform. Everything that matters is monitored, logged, and verified. There is no mystery here." The old man stopped a few feet from the tank, close enough now that the heat radiating from the armor brushed against his skin. He lifted his hand slowly, not touching it yet, just holding it there, as if measuring something invisible in the air. "That is the problem," he said, almost to himself. "You are listening to the system." The wind fell quiet for a moment, the flags in the distance hanging still, and even the low murmur from the bleachers seemed to fade. Ethan's expression hardened, irritation replacing amusement. "And what exactly should we be listening to?" he asked. The old man did not answer right away. His hand moved the final inch, resting gently against the steel, his fingers splayed across the surface as if greeting something familiar. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in strain, but in recognition, like a man hearing a voice he had not heard in years. "The tank," he said. For a moment, no one moved. The old man's hand rested against the tank as if the steel itself had weight beyond its 70 tons, as if it carried something unseen that only he could feel. The heat shimmered between his fingers and the sunlit armor, and the faint ticking of metal expanding in the afternoon temperature became suddenly noticeable, a quiet rhythm that had always been there, but had gone ignored. Ethan stared at him, waiting for something more, some explanation, but none came. Just silence. Then a scoff broke it. "You have got to be kidding me," Ethan said, shaking his head as he turned slightly toward the others, seeking agreement. A few engineers chuckled again, though this time it sounded thinner, less certain. "We have thermal sensors, pressure feedback, acoustic monitoring," Ethan continued, tapping his tablet again as if the list itself proved his point. "This machine talks to us in data, not feelings." The old man did not react to the tone. His eyes remained fixed, not on the surface, but somewhere deeper, as if following a pattern beneath the armor. "Data tells you what it sees," he said quietly, "not what it misses." The words hung there, simple and unchallenged for a second too long. A breeze passed through the range, lifting dust and carrying it along the length of the vehicle, tracing its shape in a way that made every edge and contour stand out in stark relief. The old man's hand shifted slightly, fingers brushing along a seam near the side panel, slow, deliberate, as if confirming something. Ethan exhaled sharply, impatience returning. "All right," he said, stepping closer now, his boots echoing louder in the quiet. "If you think there is something we missed, then say it. Be specific." The old man's gaze finally lifted, meeting Ethan's for the first time. There was no challenge in it, no attempt to prove anything. Just certainty. "You are listening to the engine," he said. "You should be listening to what feeds it." Ethan frowned, confusion flickering for an instant before he masked it with a dismissive smirk. "Fuel system checks are clean," he replied immediately. "We already verified that." The old man gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "You verified the pressure," he said. "Not the path." That was enough to draw a reaction. One of the junior technicians glanced toward the rear access panel again, hesitation creeping back into his posture. Ethan noticed it and snapped his attention in that direction. "We inspected the lines," he said quickly, sharper now, as if cutting off doubt before it could spread. "There is no obstruction." The old man turned his hand slightly, tapping once, gently, against the armor. The sound was soft, but it carried a dull note that seemed out of place against the otherwise hollow resonance of the tank's exterior. He listened to it, head tilted just a fraction. "There is," he said. "No emphasis, no force, just a statement. The kind that did not ask to be believed." The air tightened again, the earlier confidence in the group thinning into something else, something quieter. Ethan's jaw set, but he did not respond right away. Behind him, the observation bleachers had gone still, conversations fading as more eyes turned toward the exchange. Somewhere in the distance, a flag snapped sharply as the wind returned, and the sound seemed louder than before. The old man stepped back half a pace, lowering his hand, giving the tank space again as if it were something alive that needed room to speak. "It is not broken," he said, almost gently. "It is being held back." And for the first time since the engine had gone silent, no one laughed. The words settled heavier than the heat pressing down on the range, and for a brief moment, even Ethan did not have an immediate answer. He looked back at his tablet, as if expecting it to correct the statement for him, but the screen remained unchanged, lines of perfect data scrolling in quiet defiance of what had just been said. "Held back," Ethan repeated under his breath, the phrase sounding foreign in a place built on precision and certainty. He stepped past the old man, moving toward the rear section of the tank with sharper intent now, his earlier confidence tightening into something more defensive. "Open the rear access again," he called out. His voice clipped, and two technicians moved quickly, unlatching the panel and swinging it outward with a metallic creak that cut through the still air. The interior components sat exactly as they had before, clean, ordered, untouched by any visible fault. Ethan leaned in, scanning the lines, the connectors, the fittings, his eyes moving faster now, searching for something he could point to, something that would restore control. "There is nothing obstructing the flow," he said, louder this time, as if volume alone could settle the matter. The old man did not follow him. He remained where he stood, watching, his expression unchanged, patient in a way that did not rush the outcome. "You are looking for damage," he said. "You will not find it." Ethan straightened, irritation breaking through again. "Then what exactly are we supposed to find?" he demanded, turning back. The old man took a slow step closer, not toward Ethan, but toward the open panel, his gaze narrowing slightly as he studied the exposed system. The faint hum of distant equipment seemed to fade again, replaced by the soft ticking of cooling metal and the whisper of wind moving across the hull. "A restriction," he said, "not a failure." One of the junior technicians shifted beside the panel, glancing between Ethan and the old man, uncertainty creeping into his posture. Pressure readings would show that. Ethan snapped, catching the movement. "They do not." The old man's eyes flicked briefly to the technician, then back to the system. "Not if it is subtle," he replied. "Not if it changes under load." That was enough to pause even Ethan for half a second. His gaze returned to the open panel, slower this time, less certain, as if replaying something in his mind that no longer fit as neatly as before. The wind shifted again, carrying a faint, almost imperceptible scent of heated fuel through the air, gone as quickly as it came. The old man stepped closer now, stopping just short of the panel, close enough to see every connection without touching a single component. His eyes moved along the line, following its path not by labels or diagrams, but by instinct, by memory shaped over years no one there had witnessed. He tilted his head slightly, listening again, not to the engine, but to the absence of it. "There," he said quietly, nodding toward a section no one had singled out before, a small junction that looked identical to the rest, clean, aligned, unremarkable. Ethan frowned, stepping in beside him, his shoulder tense as he leaned closer. "That section passed every check," he said, but the certainty in his voice had begun to thin. The old man did not argue. He did not explain further. He simply looked at it, calm, steady, as if waiting for the machine itself to confirm what he already knew. And this time, no one dismissed him. No one spoke as Ethan leaned closer to the junction, the sunlight catching the edge of the metal fittings and reflecting into his eyes. Up close, it looked exactly like every other connection in the system, clean, properly seated, perfectly aligned with the design specifications he knew by memory. He reached out, running his fingers along the line, feeling for anything out of place, any resistance, any imperfection that would justify what he had just been told. There was nothing, at least nothing obvious. "It is within tolerance," he said, quieter now, more to himself than anyone else, as if saying it would restore the certainty he had lost. The old man remained still beside him, his presence steady, not pressing, not insisting, just waiting. The wind shifted again, brushing past the open panel and carrying a faint change in temperature, barely noticeable, but enough to stir something in the air between them. Ethan paused, his hand still on the line. And for a moment, he stopped looking at the numbers in his mind and started paying attention to the feeling under his fingers. It was subtle, so subtle it could be dismissed in an instant. A slight unevenness, not a blockage, not a break, just a resistance that did not belong. He pulled his hand back slightly, then placed it again, slower this time, tracing the path with more care. The technician beside him noticed the change immediately. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low, uncertain. Ethan did not answer right away. His jaw tightened, and he leaned in further, eyes narrowing as he followed the line back toward its source. "Pressure readings were normal," he said, but now it sounded like a question instead of a statement. The old man finally moved. Just a small step closer, his gaze fixed on the same section. "Normal is not the same as right," he said quietly. Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight of the words settling in. Around them, the rest of the team had gone still, watching, sensing the shift even if they did not understand it yet. The laughter from earlier was gone, replaced by a silence that felt heavier with every second. Ethan glanced back at his tablet, then back at the line, then back at the old man. The certainty he had started with was no longer enough. "If there is a restriction," he said carefully, "it is not showing in the system." The old man gave a small nod. "Then you have to find it another way." Ethan hesitated, then turned to the technician. "Get me a manual bypass check," he said, his voice steady again, but different now, less defensive, more focused. The technician blinked, surprised, then moved quickly to comply, reaching for the tools they had not used yet, the ones that required time instead of software. As the panel remained open and the first manual test began, the old man stepped back once more, returning to his quiet place just outside the circle. He did not watch the people. He watched the tank. And this time, Ethan did too. The manual gauge clicked softly into place, a sound that felt almost out of time in a space dominated by digital readouts and silent confirmations. The technician adjusted the valve carefully, his movements slower than before, more deliberate, as if he understood now that speed had never been the answer. Ethan stood just behind him, watching closely, arms no longer crossed, his posture leaning forward with focus instead of resistance. "Run it," he said, his voice low. The technician nodded and began the test, eyes fixed on the analog dial as it responded in real time, the needle rising steadily before pausing, hesitating for a fraction of a second that would have gone unnoticed an hour ago. But now everyone saw it. The needle trembled, just slightly, then continued, but not as smoothly as it should have. Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Do it again," he said. The technician reset and repeated the process. The same hesitation. Small, subtle, but real. A murmur moved through the group, quiet and restrained, as if no one wanted to be the first to admit what it meant. Ethan stepped closer, crouching down to bring his line of sight level with the gauge, watching the movement with intense focus. "That should not be there," he said, more certain now, but in a different way than before. Not certainty built on assumption, but on observation. He reached out, tracing the line back again with his hand, following the exact path the old man had indicated. This time, he felt it immediately. That same faint resistance. Not enough to trigger an alert. Not enough to fail a diagnostic. But enough to matter. He exhaled slowly, the realization settling in. "There is a restriction," he admitted, the words quiet but unmistakable. No one reacted with surprise. They had all seen it. They had all felt the shift. The technician looked up at him. "What do we do?" he asked. Ethan did not answer right away. His gaze lifted, moving past the panel, past the team, and settling briefly on the old man standing a few steps away, still calm, still watching the tank as if nothing had changed. Their eyes met for a second, and in that moment, Ethan understood something he had missed from the beginning. This was never about finding the answer faster. It was about knowing where to look. He turned back to the panel. "We isolate this section," he said, his voice steady again, but grounded now. "Piece by piece. No shortcuts." The technician nodded and began preparing the tools, this time without hesitation, without rushing. Around them, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The earlier arrogance had dissolved, replaced by a quiet focus that spread through the team like a current. No one laughed. No one questioned. They worked. The old man stepped back once more, giving them space, his role already complete in a way that did not need recognition. The wind moved across the range again, softer now, carrying away the last traces of doubt. And for the first time since the tank had gone silent, the team was finally listening to the right thing. The section was removed in careful increments, each fitting loosened with deliberate precision, each movement slower than anything that had come before, as if the entire team understood now that rushing had been the reason they had missed it in the first place. The line came free inch by inch, revealing nothing at first glance, just another clean segment of reinforced tubing that matched every specification on paper. Ethan took it in his hands, turning it slightly, his eyes scanning along its length, searching for something that still refused to be obvious. "There is nothing here," one of the engineers muttered under his breath, though the confidence behind the words had faded into something closer to doubt. Ethan did not respond immediately. He held the line steady, rotating it again, slower this time, letting the light catch it at a different angle. And then he saw it. Not a blockage, not damage, just a barely visible deformation, no wider than a hairline. A subtle narrowing along the inner curve that could not be seen from the outside unless you knew exactly where to look. His fingers traced over it, feeling the faint difference in resistance that the system had never flagged. "This is it," he said quietly. No one spoke. They did not need to. The technician stepped closer, leaning in, eyes narrowing as he followed Ethan's gesture. "That could not have triggered a fault," he said. "It is within tolerance." Ethan nodded once. "It is within tolerance," he repeated, then paused. "But not under load." The realization moved through the group without words, a shared understanding settling into place. The system had been right, and it had still been wrong. Ethan straightened slowly, holding the line for a second longer before handing it off. "Replace it," he said. No hesitation this time. The technician moved immediately, retrieving a new section, checking it by hand before installation, no longer trusting only what the system displayed. The work continued in silence, each movement measured, each step grounded in a new kind of awareness. A few yards away, the old man remained where he had been, his posture unchanged, his eyes still on the tank, not the people working on it. He did not step in. He did not offer further instruction. He simply watched, as if the outcome had never been in doubt. The sun dipped slightly lower, casting longer shadows across the concrete, the heat easing just enough to make the air feel different. Ethan glanced up briefly, his gaze drifting toward the old man again. But this time there was no sarcasm, no challenge, only a quiet acknowledgment that did not need to be spoken. He turned back as the new line was secured, the panel still open, the system ready for another test. "Run it again," he said. The technician nodded, moving to the controls, hands steady. Around them, the entire range seemed to hold its breath, the earlier noise replaced by a silence that carried expectation instead of doubt. And somewhere in that silence, the machine waited, no longer ignored, no longer misunderstood, but finally heard. The technician's hand hovered over the control for a fraction longer than necessary, the weight of every eye on the range pressing into that single moment. Then he engaged the sequence. A low electrical hum moved through the tank first, subtle but unmistakable, followed by a deeper vibration that traveled through the ground beneath their boots. Ethan did not move. His eyes stayed fixed on the open panel, watching for any sign of failure, any indication that they had missed something again. The hum steadied. The vibration deepened. And then, for the first time that afternoon, the engine answered. It did not roar to life all at once. It built, controlled, deliberate, the sound rising from a quiet mechanical whisper into a full, powerful presence that filled the range without forcing itself. The air shifted with it, heat rolling off the rear exhaust in steady waves, the kind of heat that meant the system was finally doing exactly what it was designed to do. No alarms sounded. No warnings appeared. Just function, pure and precise. The technician stepped back instinctively, eyes wide, not with shock, but with recognition. "It is running," he said, though he did not need to. Everyone could feel it. Ethan exhaled slowly, a breath he had been holding longer than he realized, his shoulders lowering just slightly as the tension released. He looked at the panel again, then at the replaced section, then at the rest of the system, as if confirming it all one more time. Everything aligned now. Everything made sense. But the silence around him told a different story. No one celebrated. No one spoke over the sound of the engine. The earlier confidence, the quick laughter, The easy assumptions were gone, replaced by something quieter, something heavier. Respect. Ethan turned, almost without thinking, his gaze searching past the team, past the equipment, until it found the old man standing exactly where he had been. He had not moved. He had not stepped forward when the engine came back to life. He had not asked for acknowledgment. He simply watched the tank, the same way he had from the beginning, as if the result had always been inevitable. For a moment, Ethan hesitated, as if unsure how to bridge the distance between them. Then he took a step forward. The sound of the engine filled the space between them, steady and controlled, a constant reminder of what had just happened. "You knew," Ethan said, not as a question, but as a realization. The old man's eyes shifted from the tank to him, calm, unchanging. "I have seen it before," he replied. No explanation, no detail, just truth. The wind moved again across the range, lifting dust into the air, carrying it past the now running machine, past the engineers who stood in quiet understanding, past the place where certainty had once lived and been replaced by something far more grounded. Ethan nodded once, slowly, the gesture small but meaningful. Behind him, the team had already begun closing the panel, their movements careful, precise, different than before. They were not just following procedure anymore. They were paying attention. And as the engine continued to run, strong and steady under the fading afternoon sun, the tank was no longer silent. And neither was the lesson it had carried with it. The engine continued to run with a steady, controlled rhythm, the sound no longer intrusive but grounding, like a heartbeat returning to something that had been silent for too long. The late afternoon sun dipped lower, stretching shadows across the range, turning the once harsh light into something softer, more defined, outlining the tank in a way that made it look less like a machine and more like something with presence. The panel was secured, tools were packed away, and the engineers stood back, not in celebration, but in quiet reflection, each of them replaying the moment they had missed something that had always been there. Ethan remained where he was, his gaze drifting once more to the old man, who had already begun to turn away, as if his part in all of this had ended the moment the engine came back to life. There was no hesitation in his steps, no expectation of recognition, just the same calm, deliberate pace with which he had arrived. Ethan took a step forward, then another, closing the distance before the moment passed completely. "Wait," he called out, not loudly, but enough to carry. The old man stopped, turning slightly, his expression unchanged, patient as ever. For a second, Ethan seemed to search for the right words, something that matched the weight of what had just happened, but none of the language he was used to felt right anymore. Finally, he settled on something simpler. "Thank you," he said. The words were direct, unpolished, but real. The old man studied him for a brief moment, then gave a small nod, not dismissive, not accepting praise, just acknowledging the understanding behind it. "Take care of what you have," he replied quietly. Ethan followed his gaze back to the tank, the engine still running, the system now whole in a way that went beyond parts and diagnostics. When he looked back again, the old man had already started walking, moving toward the edge of the range where the dust met the fading light. No one stopped him. No one called out. They simply watched as he left the same way he had come, without announcement, without ceremony. The wind moved gently across the ground, carrying the last of the heat away, leaving behind a stillness that felt earned rather than empty. Ethan turned back to the tank, placing his hand against the armor for a brief moment, not to test it, not to measure it, but to understand it. The surface was warm, steady, alive with the energy now flowing through it. And for the first time that day, he was not thinking about data or systems or tolerances. He was listening. Around him, the team moved differently, slower, more aware, each action grounded in something deeper than procedure. The engine continued its steady rhythm under the darkening sky, no longer a problem to solve, but a reminder of something they had nearly overlooked. And as the last light faded across the range, the lesson remained, quiet but undeniable, carried not in words or reports, but in the silence that followed understanding. Some knowledge is not written down. It is earned, remembered, and passed on without ever needing to be explained.